So Sony have just announced the A7IV, and I'm about to be inundated with DMs and emails about my thoughts on this camera. So I thought I'd make a video to address that, because I shoot with its predecessor, the Sony A7 III, also the A7S III and the A7S II. And as a disclaimer, I'm making this video before the official announcement by Sony, but most of the specs have been leaked, and those leaked specs have been pretty much confirmed by Sony adding keywords to the planned YouTube premiere video. So we could pretty much be confident in all of the specs, and we've also seen leaked photographs and videos online. So the main talking point is going to be the new 33 megapixel backside illuminated CMOS sensor. But before we dive into that, let's talk about the updated design of the camera body. So what we see now is pretty much an identical body to the A7S III. So the main new feature is, of course, the fully articulating screen, which is really useful for filming in awkward positions and vlogging, so you can see yourself when you're vlogging. But as an astrophotographer, it's going to be really useful when using a telescope. Quite often when using a telescope, your camera's quite low, at an awkward angle, pointing directly up, and you have to try and get underneath your camera to see what you're shooting. So the articulating screen is really useful when doing sort of deep space astrophotography, using a tracker and telescopes. The ergonomics of the camera are much better as well. I love the feel of the A7S III in the hand. It's just really nice to grip and hold. The buttons are a little bit chunkier, really nice to use and press and turn the dial. So I'm happy that they've gone with the same design as the A7S III. It also comes with dual SD card slots, which is great, and those slots can also be used for the quicker CF Express Type A slots, which is mainly for shooting in high frames per second burst modes, which is not really useful for astrophotography, but maybe something for you personally, depending on what other types of genres of photography that you shoot. Things like autofocus performance, animal eye autofocus, again, stuff that's not really interesting to astrophotographers, but may be interesting to you subjectively. We also see a change in the menu system. So the new menu that was brought into the Sony A7S III, and the menu system has been a big complaint of Sony users over the years, and personally I was never that much of a big hater. Like anything, it's just one of those things you get used to. And with Sony cameras, you can customize so many of the buttons. You have the quick access function menu, and because of those, you rarely find yourself diving into the menu anyway. But that said, the new menu system is definitely more logical, and it's definitely quicker and easier to find things, again, once you get used to it. So let's talk about the new sensor, the 33 megapixel backside illuminated CMOS sensor. So the A7 I, 2, and 3 all had a 24 megapixel sensor, which for me, I find a really good compromise between having detail in the image and having good noise performance, because normally as you increase the megapixel count, you get a decrease in noise performance. 24 megapixel RAW files are also not large in terms of megabytes, so in the long run, you will save some money on storage and hard drives and that kind of thing. And they're also easier for a computer to process. And that's especially useful in rendering time lapses or stitching big panoramas. Having smaller files just makes things easier to process. So whilst I can't say for 100% certainty just yet, I'm pretty confident that the A7 IV is going to have worse noise performance than the A7 III. And that's because of the increase in megapixels. We now have smaller pixels. They have a smaller pixel width and they become less efficient. And you run into other issues like crosstalk, where electrons jump from one pixel to the next because it's a lot busier on the sensor. So when you look at the camera like the A7S II or S3, it's only 12 megapixels. You've got nice, big, efficient pixels, and the low light performance is phenomenal. To understand this, you kind of need to understand that there are two main types of noise. There's photon noise, which is noise that is inherent in the light from the scene. So light in the real world is actually noisy, and this becomes more prominent in low light situations. When you collect a lot of light, you barely notice that there's noise in the light. But when you're not able to collect much light, the noise, the photon noise in the light itself becomes a lot more prominent. The other type of noise is read noise. So noise that is generated by the camera and its electronics, Things like thermal noise and dark current noise, hot pixels, all those kind of things that are generated within the camera's electronics. And in recent years, what we've seen in modern cameras, new DSLRs and new mirrorless cameras, is that there's not a significant increase in the performance of read noise in the cameras. It's kind of plateaued. And so, especially in astrophotography and low light situations, the predominant noise in your images is photon noise, light from the scene. And so the megapixel count of a sensor plays a huge role, because the more efficient the pixels are, the better noise performance you will see, especially in astrophotography. So if you compare the 40, 60 megapixel A7R series to the A7S, you will see a huge difference in noise performance. The A7R cameras are generally very noisy. A7S is just the low light king. But obviously, being 12 megapixel doesn't come with a huge amount of detail, although you can blow those images up and they still look great. But with that said, modern techniques like stacking for noise reduction, or taking 3 to 4 minute exposures of the foreground and 3 to 4 minute tracked exposures of the sky, will negate the noise differences between the A7IV and the A7 III, because these noise reduction methods are non-destructive. You unveil more detail. And so if you do adopt these techniques, you will end up with better detailed images with the A7IV over the A7 III. So again, whilst I can't say yet with 100% certainty, I'm 90% sure that the A7IV will have worse noise performance in single exposures. But if you do adopt non-destructive noise reduction techniques, you will ultimately end up with a higher quality image, because you've got more megapixels and you'll have a bit more detail. One thing that's still unknown right now is the ISO invariance of the A7IV. So if you don't know what ISO invariance is, I recommend you go check out my video all about ISO invariance and why it's so useful, especially for astrophotography and low light photography. The A7 III, when you go from ISO 500 to 640, there's a big improvement in the noise performance. And then the amount of noise in an image at ISO 640 is the same as the amount of noise in images taken at any higher ISO value, 6,400, 12,800, as long as the aperture and shutter speed stay the same. So with the A7 III, I'm able to shoot at ISO 640, and that protects the highlights, especially in things like the aurora, the moon, and you also capture an image with a higher dynamic range. The image is going to be very underexposed and dark, but I can selectively brighten the image quite significantly in post-production, and you're not going to unveil any extra noise than if you were shooting at ISO 6400 or 12,800. So it's a super useful feature in astrophotography and low light photography. It's something that I will sorely miss. I couldn't go back to an ISO variant camera and not miss the ISO invariance of the A7 III. So I'll be keeping a very close eye on whether the camera is ISO variant or ISO invariant. It's very likely to be ISO invariant, because that's just the way Sony go about pretty much all of their alpha cameras. It's just, when does that second gain ISO kick in? The A7S III, for example, it kicks in at ISO 1600, which isn't quite as useful as 640. So it'll be interesting to see where the ISO invariance, the second dual gain ISO, when it kicks in. I really hope it stays at 640, because it's super useful. I hope it doesn't become any higher. But as soon as I find out, I'll add a pinned comment to the video down below. So that's it, guys. I hope that kind of clears things up, and that should save me a lot of time responding to emails and DMs. But what do you guys think? Are you excited about this camera? Are you going to buy it? Are you going to stick with the A7 III? Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. And if you're going to enjoy the night sky anytime soon, I wish you good luck and clear skies.